Hi, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on today's video. On today's video, we're starting a brand new series entitled Recurring Themes in the QME Evaluation, and I have a fascinating program for you. And before we get into some of the topics that we're going to go over in this new series, I want to just set the stage by asking you, as you've gone through some of your QME evaluations, and this probably applies more to the experienced QMEs who have at least a couple hundred QME evaluations in their resume. But I want you to think about this. As you've gone through your QME evaluations and you find yourself sitting face to face with an examinee, and the examinee explains the history of their case and the history of their treatment and all of the circumstances involved with their particular scenario, have you ever found yourself realizing to yourself that you've had this case before? How many of you have ever realized when you're reviewing a case that, oh my God, I've had this case before? Now, I know the names of the examinees are different, the specific details and all of the minutia of the case are unique to each particular examinee, but if you step back and look at the big picture of your case, you've probably had a revelation inside your own mind before that told you, oh my God, I've had this exact case before. Well, that's what this program is all about. It's about the recurring themes, the situations, the circumstances, and the scenarios that present themselves to us over and over and over and over again in our QME practice. You know, the numbers of situations, circumstances, and scenarios that examinees present to us over time is not an infinite number. It's not an infinite number. In fact, the scenarios, the situations, and the circumstances that examinees bring to us script themselves into recurring themes. And there's a very finite number of recurring themes that you're going to see over and over again in your career as a qualified medical evaluator. Let me say that again. It's not an infinite number of situations and circumstances that you're going to encounter. On the contrary, it's a very finite number of situations and circumstances that you'll ever encounter in your career as a qualified medical evaluator. And it's sort of like the old 80-20 rule. Do you remember the 80-20 rule? Remember the 80-20 rule? You know, 20% of your clothes you wear 80% of the time. 20% of your carpet gets 80% of the wear, right? Whenever you go out to eat at a restaurant, 80% of the times you go out, you go to the same 20% of restaurants. Remember the old 80-20 rule? Well, if you can learn and understand and be able to identify the most common scenarios, the 20% of the most common scenarios, you'll have 80% of all your cases that you'll ever encounter whipped, because 80% of the cases that you'll ever encounter recur as themes with the 20% most common themes that you'll ever experience. Let me see if I can rephrase that again. The cases that you're going to encounter as a qualified medical evaluator script themselves into common recurring themes. 20% of those themes account for 80% of all the cases that you'll ever experience. There, I think I said that a little bit better. And in this program, we're going to go over the 10 most common of the recurring themes that you're going to see in the examinees that you'll sit face to face with over the next couple of decades of your career. Now, in this program, we're going to be tackling some difficult issues. And I want you to know in advance that we're going to be handling the tough cases. We're going to be handling the denied cases. We're going to be handling the delayed cases, the controversial cases, the difficult cases, the red flag cases. You know, it's one thing to have a very simple case that involves a bona fide incident of injury with a witnessed incident with positive objective physical examination findings immediately following the incident of injury, with a sincere examinee who goes through a reasonable period of treatment and then becomes permanent and stationary, and then we evaluate them for their permanent impairment and apportionment ratings. That's one thing. Those are not the cases that we're going to be talking about in this program. Those are the simple cases. Those are the cases which we had more of. But it seems that we get a glut of cases that have difficult issues, that have red flag issues, that are denied cases, that are delayed cases, that are controversial cases, that are red flag cases. And those are the types of cases that we're going to be handling in this program. So let me just share with you some of the topics that we're going to be talking about in this program. We're going to be talking about the situations and circumstances and scenarios that the examinees present to us that we're going to see over and over and over again. We're going to learn how to handle those, and how to dissect those situations, how to dissect those scenarios, and get to the bottom of the truth of what's actually happening so that we can do our job as a qualified medical evaluator and render opinions that are accurate, render opinions that are truthful, render opinions that are a true representation of the examinee's actual condition, and so that we can render opinions and conclusions that qualify as substantial medical evidence. So some of the issues that we're going to learn how to dissect include the unwitnessed incident with a delay in reporting the injury. And these are situations that you're going to see over and over and over again. And as I mention this to you now, you're probably thinking to yourself, yeah, I've had cases that involved unwitnessed incident wherein the examinee delayed in reporting the incident of injury. These are two red flags for industrial causation, and you're going to see hundreds of these cases. If you haven't seen them already, let me just tell you, you're going to see hundreds of cases that involved an unwitnessed incident with a delay in reporting the incident of injury. I'm going to show you exactly how to handle this particular situation. We're going to talk about false imputation. False imputation. I wonder how many of you have heard of the concept of false imputation. False imputation is different from malingering. With malingering, we have exaggerated or outright fabrication of symptoms that do not exist, that do not actually exist. That's malingering. Well, with false imputation, we have gross exaggeration or amplification of symptoms that actually exist, but are not due to an industrial injury. The examinee presents to us and imputes, this is false imputation, the examinee falsely imputes that the symptoms that they're having are due to an industrial injury, when actually the symptoms that they're actually having are not due to the industrial injury. And so false imputation is a unique animal. It's different from malingering, because with malingering, it's quite a simple matter to discover malingering, because the examinee, as they report their symptoms and their limitations with activities of daily living to us, they're reporting to us something that's not real. So it's sometimes difficult for the examinee to create a coherent and cogent package of their presentation. Now, with false imputation, it's different, because the examinee can easily and truthfully tell you in great detail about their symptoms and their limitations and activities of daily living, because those symptoms and limitations with activities of daily living are real. They're real. So they're very accurate with the details. The trick with false imputation is that those symptoms and limitations with activities of daily living are not actually due to the industrial exposure as the examinee imputes them to be. Now, you're going to encounter false imputation in every single case. in every single case that you encounter. And so I'm going to show you exactly how to handle false imputation and how to find out what, if any, symptoms and what, if any, limitations to activities of daily living are actually due to any industrial exposure. We're going to talk about job dissatisfaction, and that's going to be our very next discussion. We're going to go into job dissatisfaction. Now, let me tell you this. In your next 10 examinees, you're going to encounter 7 of those examinees who have job dissatisfaction. They have some sort of disgruntlement about their job. They have some sort of beef. Let's just call it a beef going on at the workplace. And I'm going to share with you some studies that reveal that examinees, well, let's call them applicants, who have some sort of beef going on at the workplace are twice as likely to file claims for industrial injury as applicants who have similar symptoms, meaning they have industrially related symptoms, but those with good job satisfaction don't go on to file claims for industrial injury. It's quite fascinating. It seems that job dissatisfaction is independently correlated with the incidence with which examinees or applicants file initial claims for industrial injury. And it's interesting also because when an examinee has job dissatisfaction, it greatly prolongs the recovery from any injury at work, and it greatly increases the overall and total cost of the claim. So job dissatisfaction is an interesting area where occupational managers are working on in order to reduce the incidence with which employees file claims, and in order to reduce the overall cost of claims. They're finding that it's money well spent to promote satisfaction on the job in order to offset the high costs of workers' compensation claims in applicants who are dissatisfied in some way, shape, or form with their workplace. So that's going to be a fascinating discussion, and we'll get into that in our very first discussion. We're going to talk about cases where you'll encounter aggravation of pre-existing conditions, where those conditions are either symptomatic or asymptomatic. And you're going to encounter this in almost every single case. No one comes to the workplace and no one comes to the QME evaluation with a pristine health history. Everybody's got something going on, some sort of pre-existing condition, and many times the workplace incident is simply an aggravation of a pre-existing condition. And so it's important to know how to handle those in terms of establishing your apportionment determinations. And we'll do a little subset on the aggravation of pre-existing conditions as relates to cumulative trauma injuries, cumulative trauma aggravations of pre-existing conditions. We're going to talk about post-termination claims, and you're going to find this to be a fascinating discussion. Of your next 10 examinees, 4 or 5 of them, about 45% of them, will involve post-termination claims. And there's a big movement now in the workers' compensation industry to clamp down on the handling of post-termination claims, because it seems that post-termination claims serve as one of the greatest areas for potential fraud in the industry, in terms of both employee fraud and also in terms of provider fraud, meaning medical treatment provider fraud, and also in qualified medical evaluator fraud. So it's important to be able to identify post-termination claims. It's important to be able to identify where the examinee is receiving their treatment in the case of a post-termination claim. And let me just give you a little heads up on this, because you may be dealing with a post-termination claim now on your desk. It's important to identify with these post-termination or post-employment claims, where is the examinee receiving their medical treatment? In most cases, the examinee is receiving treatment outside of the medical provider network and they're receiving treatment from providers who are willing to take otherwise denied cases, delayed cases, controversial cases, and provide medical treatment on a lien basis. And this is especially popular in Southern California, and it's serving as a great area of concern for employee and medical provider fraud. So we'll dissect post-termination claims with a fine-tooth comb. We're going to talk about cases that involve the use of alternative impairment ratings under Almarez and Guzman, and I'll show you exactly how to use Almarez Guzman so that your permanent impairment rating sticks, in other words, is upheld at the workers' compensation by the workers' compensation law judge. And I'll show you cases wherein alternative impairment ratings under Almarez and Guzman have failed, have not been upheld, because the doctor simply did it wrong. In other words, it was discovered that the doctor simply provided an alternative impairment rating under Almarez and Guzman for the purpose of providing a higher permanent impairment rating. And as we know, that's not a proper motive for the use of alternative impairment ratings under Almarez and Guzman. So we'll talk about how to properly provide for alternative impairment ratings if you so determine that an alternative impairment rating is a more accurate descriptor of the permanent impairment rating than the conventional impairment rating under the AMA guides. Okay? We're going to talk about apportionment. We're going to talk about how to properly identify cases that involve apportionment under Labor Code 4663, how to identify cases that involve apportionment under 4664. We're going to talk about examinees who, and you're going to encounter this in almost every single case. We're going to talk about examinees, and we're going to learn to evaluate their medical treatment under the microscope and look at the medical treatment and go through the medical treatment records with a fine-tooth comb to discover examinees who are failing to respond to what appears to be otherwise appropriate medical treatment. And many of the examinees that we see receive medical treatment for weeks and weeks and weeks and months and months and months and years, and no one recognizes early on that they're failing to respond to appropriate and expensive medical treatment. This is medical treatment that appears to be appropriate for their condition, that appears to be being rendered by sincere and qualified medical personnel, and yet for some reason, the examinee fails to respond to appropriate medical treatment. Well, this is a red flag. I'm going to show you how to spot that in the medical records. We're going to talk about how to identify examinees who are receiving treatment outside the MPN. We're going to talk about examinees who fail to cooperate with prescribed medical treatments. We're going to talk about examinees who fail to cooperate with the entirety of the medical program, and that includes the medical treatments as recommended by the primary treating physician and any secondary treating physicians. We're going to talk about examinees who fail to cooperate with diagnostic studies, and this can range all the way from overt denial or overt refusal to attend diagnostic studies to more covert sabotage of the diagnostic studies through failure to cooperate with instructions. For example, we have examinees who get in the MRI tube and fail to remain motionless as they are instructed to do, thereby confounding the images that result and the images upon which the diagnosis is based. So we're going to talk about all facets of examinees and their failure to cooperate with medical treatments. And then finally, we're going to talk about work restrictions and total temporary disability cases, or cases that involve periods of total temporary disability, and cases that involve examinees who will go on to require either temporary modifications to their workplace activities or permanent workplace restrictions. And we're going to include a discussion about examinees who, for whatever reason, cannot tolerate work restrictions. This is a red flag for examinee fraud. I'll show you how to identify examinees who are unable to tolerate even the most congenial of workplace restrictions. And then we'll talk about examinees who have extended TTD periods due to unchanging work restrictions. And let me just say that another way. Let me just ask you a question. Have you ever had an examinee who has been off work on an extended period of total temporary disability, but the primary treating physician never changes the work restrictions? And you would think that with an examinee who's receiving appropriate medical treatment, and you have an examinee who's off work on total temporary disability, so they're not exposed to workplace repetitive motions, workplace activities, you would expect that these examinees would show signs of improvement, and the doctor, the primary treating physician, could liberalize the work restrictions to allow the examinee to get back to some form of gainful employment. But for whatever reason, the work restrictions remain unchanging for weeks and months and years. And this is a red flag for an examinee who shows no intention of responding to medical treatment, and shows no intention of getting well, and shows no intention of returning to the pre-injury occupation. And I'll show you exactly how to identify it, and I'll show you how to handle it, because this is a situation that you're going to encounter over and over and over hundreds of times in your career as a qualified medical evaluator. So I have a fascinating program for you. I'm sure this is going to shake some of your paradigms, but you're going to realize as we go through these topics that, oh my God, I've seen these scenarios before. I've had these cases before. The reason you're going to have that revelation is because these are the scenarios that recur over and over and over again. So mastery as a qualified medical evaluator simply depends on your early recognition and your early detection of the theme. If you can identify which of the recurring themes are operative in your next examinee, then handling the case becomes simply a matter of filling in the blanks in your otherwise template. Filling in the blanks in your template. Once you've seen 50 of these cases, you'll have the entire resolution of the case templated. You won't agonize over all of the minute details that each examinee brings with you to confound the big picture of the recurring theme. So this program is intended to designed and intended to help you begin newly your career as a qualified medical evaluator. Because up till now, if you fail to identify the recurring themes, you're simply approaching each case as a brand new, novel, unique, one-of-a-kind case that's unique in all of the world, never before seen by any other qualified medical evaluator. And that's simply not the case. There's a small handful of recurring themes that we're all seeing. Up and down the state, in every state, there's a small number of recurring themes. And in this program, we're going to master the recurring themes, and we're going to master the handle of the recurring themes. So I have a fascinating program for you, and I look forward to being with you on our very next session, where we talk about job dissatisfaction and its role in workers' compensation claims. So this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I want to thank you for joining me on today's video, and I look forward to being back with you here in just a couple days.